My son said in front of the entire boardroom that I was too old to keep up with the work. Then he asked me to leave the place I had spent nearly my entire life building. Some pain does not come from strangers. It comes from the very person you once sacrificed everything for. When that moment arrives, what would you do? React immediately to protect yourself, or choose silence, even while your heart is breaking? I did not respond the way people expected, and what happened afterwards forced me to re-examine not only my relationship with my son, but also the way I had lived for many years. If you want to stay in a space where no one pushes you to be strong, subscribe and continue listening to this story. Sometimes being heard is already a form of healing. I am 65 years old. At this age, people often ask whether I have retired yet, whether I plan to hand everything over to the younger generation. I usually smile, not because I am unwilling to let go, but because I believe everyone has their own rhythm in life. When the time comes to stop, you will know. I am the founder of Horizon Bridge, a technology consulting firm. 40 years ago, I started it in a cramped rented room, working while raising my child. I did not think much about success or failure. Back then, I believed a straightforward thing. If you worked honestly, kept your promises to clients, and did not deceive anyone, a path would eventually open. I have held on to that belief to this day. That morning, I walked into the familiar conference room on the 32nd floor. I had sat in this room countless times, from the days when the company had only a handful of employees to the years of a formal board of directors, international partners, and contracts worth billions. Everything looked the same: the long table, the dark leather chairs, the glass walls overlooked the city. But the feeling was different. As soon as I sat down, I noticed the looks had changed. Not openly hostile, but cold, cautious. Conversations gradually fell silent when I entered. The air felt stretched thin, so heavy I could hear the steady hum of the air conditioning above. Daniel sat at the head of the table. My son, the current CEO of Horizon Bridge. He was 42, wearing a well-tailored dark blue suit, his hair neatly styled, his face the image of a young leader the media often praised. I had once been proud of that, not because of the title, but because I believed my son had grown into his own. Daniel began the meeting. His voice was clear and decisive, so familiar that I realized I had taught him to speak that way. He presented a major merger deal, growth figures, and long-term benefits. Everyone listened attentively until he paused and looked directly at me. "Before we continue," Daniel said, "I think we need to clarify an issue." I straightened slightly, not understanding why my chest suddenly felt heavy. "My mother," he continued, "has recently had difficulty keeping up with strategic decisions. Age brings experience, but it also comes with limitations." The room went completely silent. I said nothing. I looked at Daniel, waiting to see where he would go. "We are entering a phase that requires speed and flexibility," Daniel went on. "I'm concerned that older perspectives are no longer suitable. My mother's involvement in major decisions could cause unnecessary delays." A few people lowered their eyes to their documents. Others looked away. I felt a pain that was light but deep. Not because of the words themselves, but because I realized my son was talking about me as if I were a problem to be managed. I did not argue. I did not explain. I just sat there listening, keeping my breathing steady. A familiar thought echoed in my mind. Everything happens for a reason, and this was not the moment to speak. Daniel concluded with a brief statement. "To ensure efficiency and clarity, I propose that my mother no longer participate in strategic meetings from this point forward." Then he turned to me, his voice colder. "You can leave the room now. We'll handle the rest." No one said a word. I stood up. My hands trembled slightly, but I did not let it show. I nodded, picked up my bag, and walked toward the door. Before leaving, I looked back at the room one last time. This was the place where I had spent years protecting every employee, every paycheck, every opportunity. The door closed behind me. I stepped into the hallway. The conference room door closed quietly behind me, without a sound. It was an ordinary door closing, yet inside me, it felt like a boundary had just been drawn. The hallway was long and brightly lit. Employees passed by. Some nodded in greeting, others pretended to be busy with their phones. I did not blame them. Everyone carries their own worries. Everyone has to protect their own position. I walked slowly toward the elevator. Each step was steady, yet I could clearly feel my body trembling. Slightly, not from weakness, but because something profound had just been touched. I pressed the elevator button and took a long breath. My mind felt unusually clear. The elevator doors opened. I stepped inside alone. When the doors closed, the confined space made everything suddenly quieter. I looked at my reflection in the brushed metal wall. The woman staring back had much grayer hair now, but her back was still straight, her eyes not as panicked as I had expected. The elevator descended floor by floor. The numbers on the display ticked down. I could hear the steady hum of the machinery like a slowing breath. In that moment, many emotions tried to rise: hurt, sadness, and a trace of disbelief. But I did not allow myself to rush to label anyone. I did not think Daniel was a bad person. I did not know the people in that room were intentionally trying to hurt me. What I saw was a clear truth. Everyone was acting out of their own fear. Fear of losing power. Fear of falling behind. Fear of being seen as no longer needed. The elevator reached the ground floor. The doors opened. I stepped out and walked through the large lobby with its high ceiling and warm yellow lights. Outside, the city went on as usual. Cars moved through the streets. Pedestrians hurried past. No one knew what had just happened in a room on the 32nd floor. I got into my car and closed the door. This time, I did not start the engine right away. I rested both hands on the steering wheel and stayed that way for a moment. My heart was still racing, but I did not try to force it to slow down. I observed. I knew one thing very clearly. If I called, confronted someone, or tried to prove anything right, then I would only be speaking from pain. And decisions made in that state rarely lead to good outcomes. When I arrived home, I unlocked the door and stepped into the familiar space. This house had witnessed many stages of my life. Late nights of work, rushed mornings taking my child to school, rare quiet moments when everything briefly settled. I changed my shoes, hung up my coat, and went straight into the kitchen. I boiled water and took out my familiar teapot. Every movement was unhurried, not deliberately slow, but naturally so. When the water boiled, I poured the tea and sat down by the window. The afternoon light filtered into the room, not harsh, just enough to reveal tiny dust particles floating in the air. I took a sip, hot. A slight bitterness spread across my tongue, then softened. I did not try to analyze anything right away. I did not rush to find explanations. I let the emotions pass through as they needed to. At times, tears wanted to fall. I did not stop them. At times, a fleeting thought of blame appeared. I did not hold on to it. I watched each feeling come and go. I told myself something straightforward. Right now, I do not need to do anything. Silence is not defeat. Silence is a way of not hurting myself further. I had learned that long ago, during the years of working while raising a child. Sometimes, reacting immediately only makes things more tangled. When you are calm enough, words and actions will naturally find their place. Outside, the afternoon slowly faded toward evening. I sat there, finished my tea, and let the warmth spread through my body. The shock was still there, but it was no longer as sharp as it had been at first. I knew there would come a time when I would have to face what had just happened, but not now. Right now, the most important thing is to keep my mind steady. When the mind is constant, the path forward will reveal itself as it needs to. I remained seated a little longer until I felt solid enough to stand up. I was tidying up the kitchen when the doorbell rang. Not urgent, just 2 short, even chimes. I glanced at the clock. Nearly 7 in the evening. I was not expecting anyone. When I opened the door, I saw Linda standing there. Linda had been my assistant for more than 15 years, from the days when the company was still small, when I would rush from meetings to call home and check whether my child had eaten dinner. She understood how I worked and the quiet spaces I kept for myself. Linda looked at me, her expression hesitant. "May I come in?" she asked softly. I nodded and stepped aside. Linda entered, set her handbag on a chair, and took out a fairly thick stack of papers. She did not speak right away. Neither did I. We sat at the kitchen table. I poured another cup of tea and slid it toward her. She took it but did not drink. "I wasn't sure whether I should bring these to you," Linda said, "but I think you need to know." I looked at the papers in front of me. My heart tightened slightly, but my voice remained calm. "Go on." Linda opened the stack. Emails. Many emails. Between Daniel and several members of the board. I did not need to read them all to understand. She spoke slowly, as if afraid each word might hurt me more. "They've been discussing a gradual transfer of control. There are exchanges about you no longer being suitable to participate in major decisions." She hesitated, then continued. "They've also contacted a real estate brokerage about your house." I set my teacup down. The soft clink against the table sounded unusually loud. Linda took a deep breath. "And there's one more thing. There have been discussions about long-term care facilities. They believe it would be better for you. Safer." The room seemed to slow down. I looked at the lines on the pages. Everything was obvious, very logical, very neatly laid out. No insulting language, no emotion, just plans drawn up the way one would outline a business strategy. I felt pain. A quiet pain, not loud, not the kind that makes you want to scream, but the kind that weighs down your chest as if something heavy had been placed there. But I was not angry. I did not feel the urge to slam the table or immediately call Daniel. I did not even want to ask why. In that moment, another thought surfaced, very clearly. Perhaps Daniel did not believe he was doing anything wrong. Perhaps my son truly believed he was doing the right thing, in his own way, protecting the company, managing risk, securing the future. Linda looked at me anxiously. "Are you okay?" I nodded. "I'm fine. You did the right thing bringing this to me." After Linda left, I sat alone. The stack of papers remained on the table, not yet neatly arranged. I did not read further. I looked out the window where night had entirely fallen. I thought about the years that had passed. I thought about how I had raised Daniel. I always wanted my child to have enough safety, enough confidence, enough opportunity. I had shielded him so much. Every time he stumbled, I was there. Every time he worried, I handled it for him. I had done everything out of love. But at that moment, I began to ask myself a question I had never dared to ask before. Had I, in giving, love, also unknowingly nurtured dependence? Had I grown so accustomed to standing behind the scenes, quietly fixing everything, that my son came to believe things should always run according to his will, that I would always be there, stepping back, making room, never setting boundaries? I did not blame Daniel. I did not blame myself. I saw a truth slowly becoming clearer than ever. Some attachments are very subtle. The attachment to the role of the self-sacrificing mother, the attachment to always being needed, the belief that if you let go, everything will collapse. It may be time for me to look at those attachments again. I picked up the stack of papers and neatly arranged them, not to hide them, but to put them in their proper place, as part of the truth, no more and no less. I told myself that I did not need to act immediately. The truth was already here, and once I could see it with a mind no longer panicked, the next step would naturally reveal itself. I stood up, cleared the table, and washed the 2 teacups. Warm water ran over my hands, steady and gentle. I felt that I was still standing firm. That night, I slept deeply. No dreams, no sudden waking. When I rose the next morning, I knew a chapter had closed, not with anger, but with clarity. And from that clarity, I understood that everything ahead needed to be handled not in reaction, but with a mind ready to let go. The next morning, I called Evelyn. Evelyn has been my lawyer for more than 20 years. We met back when the company was still tiny, when I was signing contracts with one hand while holding my child with the other. She understands me not only on paper, but in the way I think. I did not say much over the phone. I only told her that I needed to see her as soon as possible. Evelyn's office is in an old building, not flashy, but always tidy and quiet. When I walked in, she looked at me for a long moment before asking, "What happened?" I told her everything, slowly, without adding or omitting anything, from yesterday's meeting to the emails Linda had brought. Evelyn did not interrupt. She listened. When I finished, Evelyn stood up, opened a metal filing cabinet, and pulled out a thick folder that had been carefully tied. "Perhaps it's time for you to look at this," she said. She placed the folder in front of me. On the cover were my name and the company's name, along with a small line of text I had seen long ago, but never truly paid attention to. Family Trust. Evelyn explained each section, her voice steady and clear. The trust had been established many years earlier when my husband was still alive. At the time, I signed the documents without reading every clause closely, not out of carelessness, but because I trusted the man who had walked beside me for so many years. Under those terms, the ultimate controlling shares of the company did not rest directly with Daniel. They were held by the trust, and the person with final decision-making authority over that trust was me. I sat still, listening to every word. Evelyn continued, "All major decisions, mergers, transfers, changes to benefit structures, require your approval." I did not feel my heart race. I felt no sense of victory, only a quiet clarity. This was not a secret meant to gain leverage. It was simply how things rebalance themselves when they drifted too far from their starting point. Evelyn looked at me. "What do you want to do next?" I was silent for a moment. I did not think about teaching anyone a lesson. I did not imagine anyone having to pay a price. Those images never appeared. Instead, I thought of the employees who had worked with me for decades. I thought of the families who depended on this company to live. I thought of Daniel, not as an opponent, but as someone now facing the consequences of the choices he had made. I told Evelyn, "I don't want to do anything out of anger. I only want to make sure that the next decisions are made with clarity." Evelyn nodded. "Then we'll take it step by step. There's no need to rush." On the way home, I sat in the car watching people pass by. I thought about something I had believed for a long time, though I rarely said it out loud. Every action leaves a trace. You don't always see it right away. Sometimes it appears much later, very quietly, but it does not disappear. Daniel had chosen his path, not to hurt me, perhaps only to prove something to the world, and now that path was leading him to a crossroads. I did not need to push. I did not need to pull. My role was to stand in the right place. That evening, I made tea again, the same old kettle, the same familiar aroma. I sat down, opened the folder Evelyn had given me, and read each page carefully, not with a defensive mind, but with the mindset of someone who bears responsibility. I knew that from this moment on, I would have to act, but that action would not come from hurt. It would come from the clarity I had gained by being willing to stop. I did not feel as though I were preparing for a confrontation. I felt as though I were stepping into the next part of a journey I had once thought was already over. And I understood one straightforward thing. When each person arrives at the outcome of their own choices, no one needs to punish anyone. Everything, on its own, is already enough. 2 days after that meeting, my phone began ringing non-stop early in the morning. I did not answer right away. I knew what was happening. Evelyn had done her part. The necessary documents had been sent, and when those dry lines of text reached the right people, reaction was inevitable. I made sure I was ready before leaving the house. When I arrived at the company building, the atmosphere was completely different. Employees moved more quickly, spoke more quietly. Some looked at me with curiosity. Others avoided my gaze. I did not blame them. In times of uncertainty, everyone tries to protect their own ground. Linda met me in the lobby and spoke softly. "The partners are here. Daniel is in the main conference room. They're asking to see you immediately." I nodded. No hurry. The conference room was more crowded than usual. The partners' representatives sat in a row, their faces tense. Daniel stood near the window, one hand braced on the table. A single glance was enough for me to see that my son was trying to remain calm and failing. When I entered, the conversation stopped. Daniel turned to me. "Mom, what is this? Why was the deal blocked at the last minute?" I pulled out a chair and sat down. I did not answer immediately. I looked around the room, then spoke, my voice slow and even. "We should address things one at a time." One of the partners could not hide his impatience. "According to the agreement, everything was ready. This delay is causing significant losses." "I understand," I said. "But no deal is ever just numbers on paper. It always carries consequences for many people." Daniel cut in. "You can't destroy everything because of personal feelings. This is the company's biggest opportunity in years." I looked at Daniel. I did not see an adversary. I saw someone who was afraid of losing control, afraid of being seen as a failure. I spoke even more slowly. "Daniel, this isn't personal emotion, and I'm not destroying anything. I'm fulfilling my responsibility." Daniel shook his head. "You don't understand how the market works anymore." I did not argue that point. I asked, "Are you sure you've looked at every clause in this contract?" Daniel fell silent for a moment. I opened the folder in front of me. I did not push it toward them as an accusation. I turned the pages and read a few key lines, clauses related to employee benefits, vague commitments, gaps that, if signed, would not harm senior leadership first. A few people on the partners' side began whispering. Daniel stepped forward. "You're making this more complicated than it needs to be. These issues can be handled later." I looked up at my son. This time, I said something I had thought through very carefully before coming here. "I'm not doing this to win against anyone. I can't allow innocent people to bear the consequences of decisions they had no part in choosing." The room fell silent. I continued in the same tone, no louder, no heavier. "The people who work here have given their lives to this company. They believe that if they do their best, the company will protect them. If today we sign an agreement that takes away that sense of security, then no matter how good the numbers look, the cost is too high." One of the partners spoke up, his voice tight. "That's the risk of doing business." I nodded. "Yes, but risk should not be pushed entirely onto those with less power." Daniel struck the table lightly. "You don't have the right to decide this on your own." I looked straight at him. "I don't want to decide alone, but in this case, I have a responsibility to stop." Daniel turned away, breathing hard. I could clearly see him losing control. I did not add anything. I waited. Finally, he turned back. "So what are you going to do? Block every opportunity?" I shook my head. "No. I'm not blocking opportunity. I'm refusing paths that require trading away too many things we can't get back." I stood up. I did not declare victory. I did not ask anyone to leave. I said one final sentence. "We will not proceed with this deal under the current terms. If there is an option that protects the people within this company, we can continue the discussion. If not, we stop here." Some of the partners stood up. The air in the room grew heavy. Daniel stood there, fists clenched, his eyes full of conflict. When everyone had left and only Daniel and I remained, he spoke, his voice lower. "Do you know what you just did? You pulled the brake on the entire road I was on. I looked at my son for a long time. Then I replied, just as slowly. I didn't pull the brake on you. I chose not to walk with you down a road I know would hurt many people. Daniel said nothing more. I gathered my papers and walked out of the conference room. This time, I did not feel shaky. I did not feel relieved. I only thought that I had stood where I was meant to stand. I knew that after this confrontation, there would still be much to do, but at least I had not allowed fear or anger to lead the way. And for me, that was enough to keep moving forward. The decision did not come immediately after that confrontation. I gave myself more time, not to avoid it, but to be certain that what I was about to do did not come from hurt. I did not want any choice I made to carry even the faintest residue of anger. In the days that followed, I reread the reports. I spoke with a few long-time managers. I listened more than I talked. What I heard did not surprise me, but it made everything clearer. Daniel had done many things, believing he was moving the company forward. But in the process, my son had grown accustomed to making decisions alone, to not pausing to listen to those behind him, and to assuming he was always right. I realized that if I continued to stand there, quietly fixing things for him and shielding him, I would not only be harming the company, but also harming myself. I would be harming Daniel himself. On the day I called Daniel into my office, I did not prepare a speech. I only prepared a calm state of mind. Daniel walked in, his eyes guarded. He knew this was coming, I thought. But learning is one thing. Being ready to face it is another. "You called me?" Daniel asked. I nodded. "Sit down." We sat across from each other. No lawyers, no board, just a mother and her son. I spoke slowly, each sentence clear. "Daniel, I've thought about this a great deal, and I need to tell you something you probably don't want to hear." Daniel looked at me, silent. "I'm ending your executive role at Horizon Bridge." The room went quiet. Daniel let out a short laugh, but it did not reach his eyes. "You're joking, right?" I shook my head. "No." My son's face tightened. "Are you punishing me because of that deal?" I took a breath. "No, Daniel, this isn't punishment." I looked at him, careful not to let reproach enter my eyes. "This is a painful decision for me and perhaps for you, but I believe it's necessary." Daniel sprang to his feet. "Then what do all these years of work mean? You're pushing me aside because of a few decisions you disagreed with." I did not interrupt. I let him finish. When Daniel fell silent, I continued. "You've worked very hard. I don't deny that. But love doesn't mean shielding someone forever. There are times when, if I keep protecting you from consequences, you'll never see your own limits." Daniel turned away. "I don't need lessons from you." I said gently, "Maybe not, but I need to do what's right in my role." My son stood there, fists clenched. I could see the hurt, the anger, and the confusion. All of it made my heart ache, but I did not step back. After a long while, Daniel asked, his voice hoarse, "So what are you going to do with me?" I answered immediately. "I'm not pushing you out of my life, but I won't keep living your life for you. You need to leave this position to learn how to stand on your own choices, not in my shadow and not under my protection." Daniel said nothing more. He walked out of the room without looking back. When the door closed, I sat still for a long time. A sense of emptiness washed over me, but it was not regret. It was the feeling of someone who had just loosened their grip on something they had held too tightly for many years. I suddenly realized that I had lived my son's life for far too long. I had carried the part of life that Daniel was meant to carry, himself. I had confused love with control. Letting go is not abandonment. Letting go is returning responsibility to where it belongs. That evening, I went home earlier than usual. I did not work anymore. I sat in the living room looking at old photographs. One showed Daniel as a child, standing beside me in my first office. Back then, I had thought I would do everything so he would never have to struggle as I had. Now I understood that by doing everything for him, I had never allowed him to learn how to stand when I was no longer there. Today's decision did not bring immediate relief, but it made me feel that I was no longer avoiding the truth. And for me, that was the first act of letting go, and also the hardest. 6 months later, the company did not look much different from the outside. The same building, the same old conference rooms, the same familiar faces move through the hallways each morning. But if you stayed long enough, you could sense that something had changed. The atmosphere was lighter. Meetings were no longer so tense that everyone measured every word. People began asking each other more questions. They listened more, not out of fear, but because they felt safe expressing their thoughts. I did not speak much about strategy or vision. I spent time meeting with small groups, listening as they talked about their work and the things that worried them. Some said they no longer lived in constant fear that a sudden decision would upend their family lives. Others said only a single sentence, "Coming to work feels lighter now." That was enough. I did not need growth numbers to prove I was right. I only needed to see people feel more secure each day. One afternoon, Linda told me that Daniel wanted to meet. I was quiet for a moment. I wasn't surprised. I also wasn't in a hurry. That day, I went home early. I made tea, as usual. When the doorbell rang, I stood up and opened the door. Daniel stood there. My son looked different. Not in his clothes or appearance, but in his eyes. Less tense, less guarded. "Mom," Daniel said quietly, "may I come in?" I nodded. We sat across from each other, as we had many years before, but the feeling was entirely different. No roles, no power, just two people trying to say what needed to be said. "I'm sorry," Daniel said. "Not to come back, just sorry for what I did and for what I failed to see." I looked at him for a long time. I felt no anger, no relief, only a profound stillness. "I'm not angry," I said, "but I need time." Daniel nodded at once. "I understand." He told me about the past months, his new job and environment without my name behind him, the moments he felt unsure and the moments he realized how accustomed he had been to being protected. I listened. I gave no advice. I offered no comfort. He needed to walk through that on his own. Before leaving, Daniel said something I will always remember. I never understood what real responsibility was until there was no one left to carry it for me. I nodded. After my son left, I sat alone, not sad, not happy, just calmer than I had felt in many years. I understood that some relationships cannot be repaired in a single conversation, nor can time be forced to move faster. Some cracks need enough silence to close on their own, if they ever do. That evening, I went into the garden and watered a few plants. The air was cool. The breeze was light. I thought about everything that had happened, without heaviness. Life did not become perfect after difficult decisions, but it became more honest. And when things are honest, the heart grows less weary. I knew I had not chosen the easy path, but it was the path that allowed me to stop turning my back on myself. Looking back on everything that happened, I don't think I defeated anyone. I did not defeat my son. I did not defeat those who once wanted to push me aside. I did not defeat circumstances. If anything changed, it was simply that I did not allow myself to lose to myself. There are times when the hardest thing is not to fight back, but to stop. Not to prove to others that you are right, but to be clear-headed enough not to hurt yourself or others any further. I once believed that love meant protecting someone at all costs, but I came to understand that some forms of protection can quietly weaken the very people we love, and that sometimes letting go is not abandonment. It is returning responsibility to where it belongs. I also learned that not every conflict needs to be resolved immediately. When the mind is unsettled, words easily become blades. When you are calm enough, many things find their own way forward, even if not in the way you once hoped. Now, when I wake up each morning, I still have work to do. I still have decisions to make, but I no longer carry the need to prove anything. I do what is right, within my capacity, and accept the consequences that come with it. Life does not become more perfect after difficult choices, but it becomes lighter when you stop carrying resentment and regret. I am not telling this story to ask anyone to take my side, nor to place blame on my son. Everyone in this story is learning their own lesson in their own way. If it were you, standing in the face of deep pain, would you choose to react immediately to release your emotions? Or would you choose to pause, even briefly, to see more clearly what is happening within you? There is no single answer that fits everyone. There is only one answer that allows you to live more lightly when you look back later. If this story makes you slow down, even a little, that is enough for me.